Welcome to my presentation of News Ninja, Gamified Annotation of Linguistic Bias in Online News. My name is Hinterreiter and I'm at the University of Würzburg as a PhD student of the Human-Computer Interaction Group. So nowadays most folks consume their news online. However, this news can be highly biased, and this bias can influence public opinion, voting behavior, or even increase polarization. In our research, we are focusing on linguistic bias. Linguistic bias is evident in word choice and framing, and describes the systematic usage of language to convey a certain view of events, groups, or individuals, often reinforcing stereotypes. The good news is we can detect this with our classifier. However, the classifier isn't perfect yet and needs more high-quality data to improve. When we tried crowdsourcing that data with the MBIG dataset, it yielded unsatisfactory results. When we used experts to create the BAPE dataset, the results were much better, but it was quite expensive and cumbersome. And this is where serious games and GWAPs come in. GWAPs are games with a purpose, basically games that use human computation to create labels and data as a byproduct of gameplay, the most famous one probably being reCAPTCHA. But there's one GWAP that relates to News Ninja and language much more, and you might actually know the guilt-tripping owl here. So Duolingo's first mission was to teach players a new language to then let them translate documents from one language to another. They pivoted their business model, but a lot of the design patterns they use also apply to News Ninja and served as a great inspiration here. The idea of News Ninja was to use a serious game, hands-on tutorial to teach newbies the concept of linguistic bias, basically helping them to get to an expert-like level, and then collecting annotations from player interactions to calculate new labels. The following research questions structured our process. So first, how can knowledge of linguistic bias be transferred in an interactive and gamified manner? Second, how can game mechanics facilitate the annotation task? And third, of course, can player-generated data achieve comparable results to expert-generated data? To answer those, we first translated the written annotation guidelines into an interactive game tutorial, and we converted the annotation process to 2 data game mechanics and gave feedback based on the BAPE ground truth. Let me show you how this looked in the game. This is the home screen where players can choose out of the 5 different game modes. If they choose the context game mode, they first choose a topic they want to do, and they can unlock more topics later in the game. In the context game mode, they focus on the sentence level, so they see the sentence on a card here, and they can grab that card and swipe it to the right if they think it's biased, or to the left if they think it's not biased. In the quick words game mode, players focus on single words. So the time is running out and they're trying to identify as many biased words as possible before it runs out. For every correctly identified word, they get a plus on time, and they also get in-game currency. For every wrong word, they get a deduction on the time. The most complex game mode is the publish game mode. Here we are combining both data mechanics. So first people see the sentence card, then they tap the biased words, and then they can swipe the sentence card again. If we already have a ground truth here, for example with BAPE sentences, they receive instant feedback, first on the sentence level and then on the word level, with missed words outlined in black. However, there are cases where we inserted new sentences and we don't have a ground truth yet. In those cases, we apply delayed feedback. This means the sentence goes to the paper section here, and players can return to a later point in time when we got a majority vote and collect their reward, which is in that case even higher and gives an incentive to return to the game. So, to answer the third research question, we measured the data quality of the game by re-annotating BAPE sentences and also by adding new sentences. Before we started the big data study, we did a pre-study to test the UX with 21 participants, an A/B test where they played through the tutorial, and 20 sentences in the publish game mode. The open-ended questions in the end revealed that there was a broad appreciation for the game's approach, and players valued the guidance of the tutorial. However, it also revealed a complexity in the annotation mechanic, which is why we came up with the 5 different game modes. Players also wished to revisit prior annotations, which is partly why we redesigned the paper section. In the main data study then, we used a streamlined version of the game. We took 370 BAPE sentences, accounting to 10% of the original dataset, and 150 new sentences, each needing 5 annotations. This took players 21 minutes, and we recruited 100 participants through Prolific. First, the players read through the introduction and the data processing agreement, and if they decided to proceed, they came to the demographic survey, played through the tutorial, and then 20 sentences in the publish game mode with the direct feedback and 10 sentences with the delayed feedback. The results showed that the re-annotated BAPE sentences had a Krippendorf alpha of 0.44 points, which is a 10.3% increase compared to the BAPE dataset, the expert dataset. And it showed a 109.5% increase compared to the MBIC, the crowdsourced dataset. And even the new sentences had an alpha of 0.39, which is exactly the same as BAPE, and a 90% increase to crowdsources. We also saw in the manual analysis that the game managed to improve misclassifications in BAPE. For example, the sentence, and of course, along the way, the hipster CEO is absolved of any responsibility to help uphold good cultural order, was labeled as not biased in BAPE, but the game corrected it to biased. So we saw that News Ninja was able to outperform the experts in some instances, and this was probably caused by the tutorial and generally speaks for combining the annotation mechanics with a game-based learning approach, gamification, and a consistent feedback system. However, there's still the danger that the mechanic is too work-like, and we probably need a more complex game around it to put less focus on the annotation task. We consistently saw that players labeled highly biased sentences as biased, but they struggled with subtle bias. For example, here the sentence, "At the time Wilson claimed he was only helping illuminate." The word claimed is by definition linguistically biased, but players were not able to recognize it as such. So the biggest limitation here was the monetary compensation. We paid players to play the game. Also our own Western-centric bias and different cognitive biases that we discuss in length in the discussion. This study had a big focus on data quality, and we did not test for learning here, and we need more sophisticated models to calculate the labels instead of the ground truth, to avoid dataset bias and also protect minorities. In the future, we want to shift from a results-oriented to a process-oriented game design, meaning instead of rewarding agreement to reward interaction. And we also want to shift our focus more to education. We started working with an educational scientist, and we're always looking for media bias literacy and game design researchers here. Then we want to test the bias detection skills pre and post the tutorial, and we also want to measure the user experience and the player experience before finally uploading it online and publicly available to test if it performs in the wild as well. So to conclude, News Ninja was able to achieve results comparable to experts, while the approach is quite scalable and adaptable, and it also shows great potential to be used in educational settings. It could be extended to other natural language processing tasks, for example, misinformation detection or hate speech detection. And it has the big perk to keep usually static datasets updated and dynamic through player interactions. And most importantly, it brings more attention and awareness to the topic of media bias. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing this further with you. Here are the references I used during the presentation, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.